let's talk about In Green's Jungles by Gene Wolfe, the second book in the Book of the Short Sun and the 11th book in the solar cycle, the penultimate book of the whole thing. And yes, what a book. What a book. I'll split this review into two parts. This is all non-spoiler, but the first part is non-spoiler about the whole series, the whole solar cycle, the whole, the short sun. And the second part will contain spoilers for previous books, light spoilers, but spoilers for previous books, but no spoilers for this. This is an amazing novel. It's one of my favourite by Wolfe. It really is a masterwork by him. There's a lot of things going on that are good about it. One, let's say, it's that his style, his mid-career style, mid to late career style, where his prose is compressed a lot and it's highly efficient. We use that word, and it's not a bad word, but it's highly elusive and suggestive, and trying to do a lot of work in a small amount of space. It is about at its peak here, and I think I might have said something similar in On Blue's Waters, the first book of this series, that it really is an accomplishment in prose. He's incredibly good over the course of, this is less than 400, I think On Blue's Waters was about 350 or something, I need to double check. Just get a lot done, a lot of character work, a lot of world work, lots of story work, and because he's good at all those things, he's good at world building, he's good at plot, he's good at character, and the prose is very efficient for doing that. The authorial voice of the first person narrator is increasingly effective and deeply compelling. It's always been compelling, but it's something where now you begin to be really overwhelmed by it at points. You're really driven along, by the flow. The story is expansive, world hopping, covering many time hopping, talking about all kinds of different things going on. It's incredibly ambitious. You could argue that they're in fact not. I talked to a channel regular and book group friend Matthew about this on the Discord, on my Discord for books, and I said, oh yeah, there's another time track, but actually, in terms of there's multiple strands of the plot being narrated, interleaved, stuff that's happening in the present to the narrator, stuff that's happened to the past that he's reporting, that kind of thing. And you realise at one point you could argue that the book as a whole covers something like 4 different time tracks and issues and discussions. It's all very ambitious, but all pulled off very well. These are considered difficult books due to this more than anything else. I think if you're used to Wolfe style and if you get on with it, and you're only going to read this after reading lots of other books generally, if you're used to Wolfe style and you get on with this works really well. And I, to my fellow Wolfians, I'd say I found it less problematic in some respects than Wizard Knight, not in terms of keeping plot things straight up, but in terms of just understanding the basic things that are happening and where they're happening. Sometimes it took me a moment, but it wasn't that hard, it wasn't that bad. There's a lot going on though, absolutely. I think the final thing I'd say in this kind of super non-spoilery section is that at this point he is bringing, as a composer, he is bringing in the final movement to land. It's not there yet, but he is beginning to bring in motifs from the early movements. He's beginning to work out things he's been considering, and these are kind of exciting and fun books and adventurous books and also philosophical and emotional books, and he's pulling all of that together now, and he's often, there's many, and it's not just things to do with that, but it's often an incredibly moving book, but particularly as a payoff, there's a lot of, it is moving because it is pulling things together, it is reconsidering themes. Not all, and by pulling things together I don't mean, do you remember that plot point from book X, chapter 17, with this and this and this, that's finally resolved. There are things like that, certainly, old mysteries being brought up, but it's not really about that so much as, like I say, musical motifs, things being brought back up to resolve a theme or to remind you of a way you've looked at a problem before in the series. This happens actually also in on Blue's Waters. There's a particular thing in that, but this is something where he has written prior to Short Sun 9 books, prior to this 10 books, and there's a lot to kind of mull over, and in that sense we really have a masterpiece conclusion here. I think some people have said it's a shame these are, you really have to have read the other Solar books before these, and therefore there's a high gate, but it does not mean that it is not worthwhile. These are amongst Wolfe's very best books, and he is perhaps the best author after Tolkien, but after Tolkien's career in the 20th century. Now, if you've read the previous books, I'm assuming up to On Blue's Waters here, up to On Blue's Waters. So if you don't want any spoilers on any of those, on the first 9 books, 10 books, go away now. This is, this is brilliant. The big stuff going on here is that we have another part of this fascinating device that is, there are lots of reasons, and I think there's intentional reasons why Short Sun, with a very different narrator and a very different tone, mirrors some of the plot structural dynamics of Book of the New Sun. And so here we move in the present, we start in a Spanish or South American themed area of Blue, where with his friend, the erstwhile Rajan of Gaon has headed on, is now known as that he considered potentially to be a Strago, a witch or wizard, but called Encanto, a fitting name of course. But he is in this place, and he ends up helping a rather nice gentleman called Inclito, very good host who hosts him in his house, helping him in an emerging political situation. That's the setup for the present day plot, while he now continues and focuses on what happens after the lander reached green in the past. And the way that he does that, the way he tells that story, is incredibly interesting. That's into spoiler territory to talk about the way things are structured and how he wants to talk about stuff. But the narrator, and the kind of issue of what's going on with the narrator comes up more and more here, and is, both apparently made obvious, but also made incredibly confused, made incredibly complex. And so there is some, which is interesting. That's a very Wolfian thing, of course, but the idea that he says, look, here is a secret revealed, but that just makes this stuff more confusing. There's a lot of that going on in lots of areas here, suffice to say. So yes, you have this kind of continuing dual track, and then with other things coming into at points where he wants to bring up X or Y, and which are profoundly worth reading and not worth spoiling. In terms of, there's a lot of very good characters here. Inclito, Father, and Mora, who are the 3 most important Blue characters who you spend time with, are very, very good. There's also, as I said in the kind of non-spoilery section, complete non-spoiler section, there's also all kinds of both secrets of the past being revealed, what's happened in certain cases being revealed, so on a bigger scale than I think I expected at points. And there's also motifs being brought up without being an issue being directly addressed, without something directly being resolved from another book or whatever, but where he wants to bring up an idea. And this, to me, these are sometimes more dramatic, though sometimes more subtle, both and examples of the kind of thing that the issue of what happens between the narrator and Sirach in the first book, and the way that contrasts with Severian and allegations against Severian, and how he also addresses that in Earth of the New Sun. So there's a lot more of that kind of stuff, where you have not just a secret being resolved, but also a motif being raised, and that one is almost a very direct parallel, but in other cases there's different kinds of ways they're brought up, either a clear reference, and in fact some of these are references that I think go far as back as Blue's Waters as well, that are now explicated. But yeah, it makes it a very satisfying penultimate chapter to the solar cycle. It's a very clear exploration of lots of things that Wolfe's been wanting to talk about, to do with virtue, to do with what he often would say about Severian, or we often read about him talking about Severian not being Christ or a Christ figure, but a Christian, becoming a better person over the course of those books. That's a massive theme throughout, and there's a lot of that going on here to do with what being human means and what being a better human means, and certainly in that Wolfian sense what being a Christian means. Take or leave any background to that, but in the context of the solar books, that obviously has a clear set of ideas and reference involved. The mythology it continues to be great. We learn more about Green, we learn more about the neighbours, we learn more about the Inhumi, all the things you'd expect. We learn more about the world. I think one way, and this is not a spoiler at all, but say I said there is a plot structure thing that is parallel and similar to Book of the New Sun, and by that I mean, well, what happens in that book is that Severian pops all over the place, travels to all kinds of new places, and of course functionally at points, though more rarely, has sort of flashbacks or understandings of things that have happened in the past, for Al-Zarbi related reasons, and also narrative related reasons. People tell him stuff, he tells people stuff, he reflects on a thing that had previously happened. That is a thing that New Sun is, and that fits into the picaresque element too. By that I mean the travelling around does. Here you have a similar structure in these two books, of the narrator going round first on Blue, in Blue's Waters. You have him, he starts in Gaon, and then he narrates a travelogue across Blue. And here you have him start in Nova Citta, or whatever it's called, and talk, learn about this area, tell you about this area, you learn mythology about this area. You also get all the way from Lizard to Pajaraku in book one, don't you? But here you then get, as the parallel travelogue, using a very different technique, discussing what happened on Green. When he talks about having, we know this of, oh no, we're not going back to the wall, we're actually, it's sort of trapped to take victims to the Inhumi. Okay, great, we go there, what happens there? And there's a variety of other things going on, but that structure is similar. A difference is the relative clarity here of the narrator's mind. The narrator is complex and confusing or confused or something, but I would not say there's a strong sense of unreliability a lot of the time as to the depiction of events, and that itself I think is a big motif being resolved in the solar cycle. What there is, I think there are authorial questions, of course. What there is this clarity in terms of storytelling technique, which is very similar to Long Sun, and Long Sun, of course, is presented third person, albeit it's written by people. It's written by Horn and Nettle, and so though it's not really objective in that sense, and that is discussed a bit, isn't it, in the epilogue, it is broadly speaking objective. It's meant to just narrate events, and here you get an interesting thing where you have a first person narrator, but who is trying to do some of the same stuff, saying, look, this is just some events that happened, and this is a fairly clear way of describing them, and I think that makes each of these different things, these different time tracks and events and affairs, with all the authorial eccentricities there may be, kind of quite clinical in a positive sense, quite clear, and as I say, resolves that motif, that meta structural motif from book one, from books 1 to 4, from the Book of the New Sun, and it's a very pleasant book to read in that sense. It is deeply moving, and can't go into that obviously, but I'd repeat that point that it is not just because he's paying off stuff from the past, but he's now paying off stuff from the Book of the Short Sun, and from the author, the narrator, who we're heavily invested in, obviously, at this point. So yeah, I highly recommend it. If you've not started Book of the Short Sun and you've naughtily continued on here, then I'd certainly say, it's worth getting to Book of the Short Sun. I would read all the others. I'd read New Sun, Earth, Long Sun, in whatever format you want to there. But I'd certainly say if you've read On Blue's Waters, you're probably going to read this, but I would certainly say read it. If you're not sure because you're thinking there's another 700, 800 pages left in this series, is it going to pay off? It's already paying off big time here. It's a funny thing to think in some ways, to me, in my head, that Wolfe wrote for functionally another 18 years and published for another 20 years or whatever, but wrote for another 18 years after, and wrote well after Return to the Wall, because there is an obvious bookending issue here, and there's 20 years between the early 80s and the early noughties where he writes the solar cycle, and he tells not just one story but several stories, and he addresses not just one big issue but many issues. He addresses it concisely, movingly and effectively, and there's a career just in that. You write that and say one of the most respected and loved fantasy authors, Robert Jordan, basically largely wrote 12 or whatever it is Wheel of Time books. It's what some people do. But for Wolfe, this is obviously the crowning achievement, and the crowning achievement is not therefore Book of the New Sun, as much as I love Book of the New Sun, but I think I'm coming to the point where if Return to the Wall continues in the same vein, I'm going to think that the crowning achievement was finishing off the solar cycle with Book of the Short Sun. If you've read it, tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.